If we look at how it was translated as heathen, it was first translated as heathen in Leviticus 25:44, and it was talking about the nations that were round about Israel. Now, yes, those words, those people were heathens. And when it says heathens, yes, they were heathens. However, the word Goyim, as we see, that is used to describe these same people, that word was used to describe Israel in Exodus 19:6. They were going to be a holy nation, and that all the sons of Noah were divided into nations, Goyim, and that it was used that Abraham would be a father of many nations, Goyim. We see that it's been used that way throughout all of Scripture. Now all of a sudden it's heathen. See, this is the reason it begins to become confusing. And it's the reason when we start seeing Gentile and things, we build up something that really doesn't appear within Scripture, and it really shows the ignorance of people who want to use it to prove some kind of racial agenda. And now we look at the way, one of the ways that it was used as people in Joshua chapter 3 verse 17. And the priests that bear the ark of the covenant of Yahuwah stood firm on the dry ground in the midst of Jordan, and all the Israelites passed over on dry ground until all the people, Goyim, people, all the Israelites passed over on dry ground till all the Goyim were passed clean over Jordan. Now, if that word was Gentile, it would make sense, but the word is nation. So all the people, all the nation had crossed over. All right? So I think so far this is an overwhelming case for what I'm saying here, because this is just Scripture, and I provided all the evidence. There's no excuse from this point on to use this for any kind of racism. And for those of you who are using it for racism, you don't really understand the way that Israel really worked, because as soon as a person of another nation became a sojourner, they were no longer called a Goyim, because they were a part of the nation, the Goy of Yahuwah, which was Yisrael, the holy nation. Remember Exodus 19 verse 6. For those of you who are like, man, I can't believe he's saying this. Exodus 19 verse 6. Those people came and they sojourned with them. When the Hebrews came out of Mitzrayim, there were a mixed multitude. We see that Yahuwah made promises that all the nations, the Goyim, shall flow to his house of prayer in the latter days. We also know that they're going to have to come through gates, because there are going to be gates to the city, and those gates will have the 12 tribes, the names of the 12 tribes on them. We know that these people, from Yahuwah is gathering all people. This is within the Old Testament. I'm going to make another video that's going to explain more of those, the salvation for Gentiles or Goyim in the Old Testament soon. Also to go with this one, but first I wanted to just build this foundation. So then in Judges chapter 2:20, we see, and the anger of Yahuwah was hot against Israel, and he said, because that this people, 1471, Goy, hath transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and have not hearkened unto my voice. So then there again, we see that it's used for Israel. Now, again, for those of you who are trying to use this in some ignorant way and trying to use it for racist ways, you need to understand Isaiah 42 verse 6 says, I, Yahuwah, have called thee in righteousness, and will hold thine hand, and will keep thee, and give thee for a covenant of the people, and for a light unto the Goyim. Those of you who hate Goyim and are using the Old Testament to try to perpetuate your hatred, Yahuwah is going to gather the nations. Yahuwah is going to judge the nations. And yes, many are going to fall. Many are going to be judged by Yahuwah. But Yahuwah shows mercy to anyone who will sojourn with his people and love his name. We see in Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, he says to the sojourners and to those strangers in the land, that if they would love the name of Yahuwah and they would keep his Shabbat, that they would have a name in his house of prayer that would be greater than sons and daughters. So Yahuwah has made promises to the nations. And those of you who are trying to take that away from the nations, you are fighting against Yahuwah, and you will not win. In the Greek now, we see why we've got the abstract form of Gentiles. Okay, we look at the word in Greek, because it appears in Greek. It appears is from two different words in Greek were translated into Gentiles. So now this is kind of a little bit of the opposite. Now in Hebrew, we've got one word, goy, or goyim is the plural, that is translated into 4 different words, but goes back to one root word. But in this case, we have 2 root words that could be translated into one word. Now this also creates a little bit of confusion. The first one we're going to look at is the Greek 1484. In the Strong's Concordance, it appears 164 times in 152 verses in the Greek Concordance, and this word is ethnos, which can mean a multitude. If we look at the word ethnos, it seems to look like ethnicity, the eth, So yeah, it could begin to mean in the Greek mindset of ethnic groups or something, multitudes of people, different types of people, diverse peoples, or peoples. Okay, we've seen this used as peoples. Now it's used in Luke chapter 2 verse 32. It says, "A light to lighten the Gentiles, the ethnos, and the glory of thy people Israel." In the book of Acts 13:47. "For so hath the Lord commanded us, saying, I have set thee to be a light of the Gentiles, and thou shouldest be for salvation unto the ends of the earth." Now, I said Lord, this is because I was reading the King James, but that's Yahuwah speaking. "For thus has Yahuwah commanded us, have I set thee to be a light unto the Gentiles." Okay, we just read that word, and in the Greek Septuagint, this is a quote from the prophecy previous, but the Greek Septuagint is also translated as ethnos. So there, that is talking about the nations. We can carry that word directly back to Goyim because this is a quote from Hebrew scriptures, so we know that this is talking about nations. Now, this is where I agree with many people, and this is where I want to extend an understanding to show why I understand why the word has been misused and abused, because also the other word that could be translated Gentiles is Greek 1672, and it's the word Helen, and it appears only 27 times in 26 verses. The word Helen describes the Hellenists, which were Greeks. It comes from the story by a man named Homer, who wrote a story about Helen of Troy. And that's where this comes from. It comes from Helen, and we see that this is so like the Greeks and so like the nations other than Israel. This is where I understand where people are coming from, because they had, it was a woman that represented, their way of thought. All the pagans always had some woman, most of the time some sex nympho goddess or something like that. In this case, that's not the way it was presented, but there's always a woman to represent, nations and multitudes of people. So this is, the way that we see that the other nations think. This is not the way the Hebrew nation thinks, okay? They did get mingled up in some of that mess, okay? But that's not the way that they initially thought back in Abraham's day, when he was the first Hebrew. So, and we're going to look at this. We're going to look at John chapter 7, verse 34. Yahushua was saying, the time's coming where you're going to look for me, you won't be able to find me. And in verse 35, they said among themselves, the Jews said among themselves, "Where will he go that we shall not find him? Will he go unto the dispersed," which was talking about of the 12 tribes of Israel, the dispersed, "among the Gentiles," that word's the Hellenists, "and teach the Hellenists also," or the Greeks. And that's what that word really means, Greeks. So we know that during the Maccabean revolt that the Greeks had intermingled with the culture, that the Greeks had completely taken defiled the temple, that they had, were defiling, the people, that they were telling the people to abandon the Torah, abandon Yahuwah, and there was the Maccabean revolt, and, we know that, they reclaimed the temple. But the Greeks were intermingled with their people. The Hebrews had learned their language. They were mixing together, mingling together. This wasn't supposed to be. And by this time, many of the tribes that were dispersed among Greeks. That's what it even says here in John 7:35. So mostly this word appears as Greeks. Sometimes it appears as Gentiles, and that creates a bit of confusion. Uh, we see in Romans 2:10 this word is used as Gentile. But glory, honor, and peace unto every man that worketh good, to the Jew first, and also to the Gentile. That would be to the Hellenists. So what happened, because they were the immediate other nations that were already within their culture, the Hellenists. Okay. So I hope this kind of helps some of the confusion. If you're going to use Goyim to mean something racist, then you're wrong. If you're going to use Hellenists to describe people that are Greek and have Greek mindsets, then that makes sense. But let's look at the roots of words before we just start speaking ignorantly